Sometimes the deepest pain comes not from our enemies, but from those we trusted most. There's nothing more crushing to the human spirit than being betrayed by your own family and left to face the darkness alone. Eirik Skullbreaker was once the most feared warrior in the north. Now he sits chained to a sacred tree, abandoned by his bloodkin for crimes he never committed. The cursed iron burns his flesh as ravens circle overhead. Then a small orphaned girl named Svala finds him in the forest. She's not afraid of this giant warrior. She places her tiny hand on his shoulder and whispers something that will change everything. What she says awakens ancient powers and begins to break the curse that binds him. But what secret could a child know that even the gods have forgotten? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the village of Ironhold like the breath of sleeping gods, weaving through wooden houses and stone foundations that had weathered countless winters. In the distance, hanging from an ancient oak's gnarled branch, Eirik's war-hammer bone-crusher swayed gently in the dawn breeze, a massive weapon of legend now serving as a grim reminder of fallen glory. The hammer's runic inscriptions caught the early light, symbols that once struck fear into the hearts of enemies. Across the northern seas, 3 moons had passed since the great betrayal, yet the villagers still spoke of Eirik Skullbreaker in hushed tones. Children who once gazed upon him with wonder now crossed themselves when his name was mentioned. But there was a time, not so long ago, when this same man had been their greatest protector, their shield against the darkness that dwelt beyond. The old forest's edge. Eirik had served Jarl Hrothgar for 20 winters, ever since the day he'd proven himself worthy by single-handedly defending the village against a pack of dire wolves. He was barely 16 then, tall for his age, but still growing into the massive frame that would earn him his fearsome reputation. The Jarl, impressed by the young man's courage and strength, had taken him into his warband as the youngest raider. In living memory, those were golden days, when the longships returned heavy with treasure and tales of distant lands. Eirik's loyalty to his clan was absolute, his devotion to Jarl Hrothgar unwavering. He fought with the fury of a berserker, but retained the tactical mind of a seasoned commander. His fellow warriors respected him, his enemies feared him, and the people of Ironhold looked upon him as their guardian. The great hall of Jarl Hrothgar had echoed with laughter those evenings when the warband returned from successful raids. Eirik would sit at the Jarl's right hand, his massive frame dwarfing even the largest of his companions. His brother Magnus would be there too, smaller in stature but quick with wit and silver-tongued in his speech. Where Eirik was the sword, Magnus was the voice that negotiated treaties and arranged alliances. "Tell them of the Saxon lord who wet himself when he saw you approach," Magnus would say, raising his horn of mead high. "Tell them how he offered his daughter's hand in marriage just to avoid facing Bone Crusher in battle." Eirik would shake his great head, uncomfortable with such praise, but the Jarl would insist. "Let them hear of your deeds, my champion. Let them know what manner of man protects their hearths." Those memories felt like echoes from another man's life now. The man who sat chained to Ygra's root bore little resemblance to that celebrated warrior. The cursed iron had carved deep furrows into his wrists and ankles, and his once golden beard was now streaked with premature grey. The runic tattoos that covered his arms, marks of honor earned in battle, seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life, responding to the dark magic that bound him. But even in his current state, even betrayed and abandoned, Eirik's thoughts often turned to a small figure who wandered the village streets like a lost spirit. Svala had appeared in Ironhold 3 summers ago, carried unconscious in the arms of a traveling merchant who claimed to have found her beside a burned farmstead. No family came forward to claim her, no relatives appeared to take her in. The village elders, moved by pity, had given her shelter in the temple of Freya, where the wise woman Astrid could watch over her. From the beginning, there had been something different about the child. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried a weight that seemed impossible for one so young. She would sometimes stop in the middle of play and stare into the distance, as if seeing things that existed beyond the veil of the visible world. The other children kept their distance, sensing something otherworldly about her. But Svala never seemed to mind the solitude. Astrid, the temple keeper, was a woman of considerable wisdom who had served as spiritual guide to the village. For more than 30 years, her silver hair was always braided with small bones and carved tokens, signs of her connection to the old ways. She had taken particular interest in Svala, recognizing signs that others missed. That child dreams of things that have not yet come to pass, Astrid would tell anyone who listened. I've seen her wake in the night, speaking words in the old tongue, words she could not possibly know. There's power in her, ancient power that stirs when the moon is dark. The village elders had nodded gravely at such pronouncements, for they remembered the old stories. In their grandfather's time, there had been others like Svala, children touched by the sight, blessed and cursed with knowledge of things hidden from ordinary folk. Most had learned to fear such gifts, but Astrid saw them as sacred, Svala's daily. Routine was simple but telling. Each morning she would tend to the small garden behind the temple, speaking to the plants in whispered tones that seemed to encourage their growth. The vegetables grew larger and more vibrant under her care than anywhere else in the village, even in poor soil and harsh weather. In the afternoons, she would wander the outskirts of Ironhold, always drawn toward the old forest, despite Astrid's warnings. Stay clear of those dark paths, child, the wise woman would caution. There are things in those depths that even the gods fear to face. Ancient powers sleep there, and it's best not to wake them. But Svala felt a pull toward the forest that grew stronger with each passing day. In her dreams, she walked paths between towering trees where the sunlight barely touched the ground. She heard voices calling to her in languages she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. Most troubling of all, she dreamed of a giant figure wrapped in chains, his face marked by terrible sorrow. The dreams had grown more vivid after Eirik's fall from grace. On the night he was accused of the unthinkable crime, the murder of Jarl Hrothgar's young son. Svala had awakened screaming, her small body trembling with visions of betrayal and injustice. Astrid had rushed to comfort her, but the child's words were disturbing. They lie, Svala had whispered in the darkness. The giant's hands are clean. The real killer walks among them still, wearing the face of trust. Astrid had hushed the child, fearing such words might be overheard and misunderstood. The village was in turmoil, demanding justice for their beloved prince's death. Eirik's protests of innocence fell on deaf ears. The evidence seemed overwhelming. A bloodied knife bearing his mark, witnesses who claimed to have seen him near the prince's chambers, his own inability to account for his whereabouts during the crucial hours. Magnus, Eirik's own brother, had been among those who spoke against him at the trial. His testimony had been the final nail in the coffin of Eirik's defense. I grieve to speak these words, Magnus had said, his voice heavy with apparent sorrow, but I cannot let blood ties blind me to justice. My brother has grown proud and ambitious. He believed himself more worthy to lead than young Prince Björn. I saw the jealousy in his eyes, heard him speak words of resentment. When the prince rejected his counsel one too many times, Magnus had trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air like poison. The villagers had gasped at this revelation. If Eirik's own brother believed him guilty, what hope was there for his innocence? Jarl Hrothgar, devastated by the loss of his heir and the betrayal of his most trusted warrior, had pronounced the sentence with tears in his eyes. Eirik Eriksson, called Skullbreaker, you are found guilty of the murder of Prince Björn Hrothgarsson. You are stripped of all honors and cast out from the clan. You will be bound with the cursed chains of Ygra's root, there to await the judgment of the gods. May they have mercy on your soul, for I can find none in my heart. The cursed chains were artifacts of ancient power, forged in the earliest days when gods walked among men. They were said to burn the flesh of the guilty while granting peace to the innocent. When they were locked around Eirik's wrists and ankles, they immediately began to sear his skin, seeming to confirm his guilt in the eyes of all who witnessed it. But Svala knew better. In her dreams, she had seen the truth. A web of lies spun by a master deceiver, a betrayal so complete and cold-blooded that it defied comprehension. The real murderer walked free while the innocent suffered. The chains burned not because Eirik was guilty, but because they had been tampered with, corrupted by dark magic to serve false purposes. Now, as autumn painted the leaves in shades of gold and crimson, Svala could no longer ignore the pull that drew her toward the old forest. Each night, the dreams grew stronger. Each morning, she felt the weight of knowledge she could not yet fully understand. She knew that somewhere in those dark woods, chained to the sacred tree, a giant warrior waited for redemption that might never come. The wise woman Astrid watched the child with growing concern, sensing the approaching storm. The old ways were stirring, powers long dormant beginning to wake. Change was coming to Ironhold, carried on the whispered prayers of an orphaned girl and the dying hope of a betrayed champion. In the distance, Bone Crusher continued its lonely vigil, waiting for hands worthy to wield it once more. The morning that would change everything began like any other in the village of Ironhold. Svala awakened before dawn, her small hands clutching the worn blanket that Astrid had woven for her. The dream had been different this time, clearer, more urgent. She had seen the giant warrior's face twisted in agony, heard his voice calling, out not in pain, but in desperate longing for truth to be revealed. But most disturbing of all, she had seen the blood on Magnus's hands. Astrid was already awake, stirring a pot of healing broth over the temple's central fire. The wise woman's movements were deliberate and calm, but Svala could sense the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept darting toward the forest's edge, visible through the eastern window. "You saw it again, didn't you?" Astrid said without turning around. "The truth that burns behind the lies?" Svala nodded, though she knew the older woman couldn't see her. "His brother's hands are stained with innocent blood. The giant suffers for crimes that were never his." Astrid set down her wooden spoon and finally faced the child. Her weathered features bore the weight of many secrets, accumulated over decades of serving as the village's spiritual guide. "Child, you speak of things that could cost both our lives if heard by the wrong ears. Magnus Eriksson sits at Jarl Hrothgar's right hand now. He has filled the void left by his brother's disgrace. But you believe me," Svala said simply. It wasn't a question. The wise woman was quiet for a long moment, her fingers unconsciously tracing the carved runes that decorated her staff. "I have seen enough winters to know that truth and justice do not always walk the same path. Yes, child, I believe you, but belief and proof are different creatures entirely." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the temple's entrance. Both woman and child turned as Magnus Eriksson himself appeared in the doorway, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was a man of average height, but possessed a natural charisma that drew others to him like moths to flame. His auburn beard was perfectly groomed, his clothes rich but not ostentatious, his smile warm and practiced. "Good morning, wise Astrid," Magnus said, his voice carrying the honey-smooth tones that had made him such an effective negotiator. "I hope I'm not intruding on your morning prayers." "Never an intrusion, Magnus," Astrid replied carefully. "How may we serve you?" Magnus's eyes shifted to Svala, and for just an instant the child saw something flicker behind his pleasant expression, something cold and calculating that made her skin crawl. "I've come about the child, actually. There have been reports that she's been speaking strangely about recent events, disturbing the peace with wild tales." "She is but a child," Astrid said, moving protectively closer to Svala. "Children often have vivid imaginations, especially when trying to make sense of tragedy." Of course, Magnus nodded reasonably. But some of these tales suggest my brother might be innocent of the crimes for which he suffers. Such talk is dangerous. Astrid, it undermines the justice that Jarl Hrothgar has decreed and causes unrest among the people. Svala felt the power stirring within her, the same force that made plants grow stronger and allowed her to see beyond the veil of ordinary sight. Without conscious thought, she stepped forward and looked directly into Magnus's eyes. Where were you? The Night Prince Björn died? The question hung in the air like a blade suspended over Magnus's head. For a moment, his mask slipped completely, and Svala saw the murder in his soul as clearly as if it were written in runes across his forehead. His hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his belt before he caught himself and forced another smile. With Jarl Hrothgar and the other advisors planning the next season's raids, he said smoothly, as I testified at the trial, you lie. The words came from Svala's lips with such quiet certainty that they carried more weight than any shouted accusation. I see the prince's blood on your hands. I hear his final words echoing in your dreams. Magnus's face went pale, then flushed red with anger. Astrid, you must control this child before her fantasies cause real harm. Perhaps she needs to learn that some dreams are too dangerous to speak aloud. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Astrid stepped fully between Magnus and Svala, her staff held firmly in both hands. The child speaks only what she sees, Magnus. If her words trouble you, perhaps you should examine why. For a tense moment, the three stood frozen in a tableau of barely contained hostility. Then Magnus's training in diplomacy reasserted itself, and he stepped back with a carefully crafted expression of wounded dignity. I came here hoping to help guide a troubled child toward wisdom, he said. Instead, I find my grief over my brothers. Fall being weaponized against me, very well. But know this, Astrid, the Jarl will hear of this conversation. If the child continues to spread poison about matters she cannot possibly understand, there may be consequences. Magnus turned and strode from the temple, but not before Svala caught one final glimpse of the fury burning behind his eyes. She knew with absolute certainty that she had just made a deadly enemy. We must leave, Astrid said the moment Magnus was out of earshot. Pack only what you can carry easily. We cannot stay here any longer. Where will we go? Svala asked, though part of her already knew the answer. To the old forest, Astrid replied grimly, to the one person who might still have the power to set things right. As they gathered their few essential belongings, Svala felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a cloak. The dreams that had plagued her for months were finally leading toward their purpose. The giant warrior who suffered in chains needed more than just her belief in his innocence. He needed proof, and perhaps she could provide it. But first, they had to reach him alive. The journey through the village was tense, every shadow potentially hiding watchers loyal to Magnus. Astrid had chosen a route that took them past the old shrine of Odin, where they could gather one final artifact that might prove crucial to their mission. Hidden beneath the shrine's altar was an ancient runestone, one that Astrid's grandmother had placed there generations ago. The wise woman retrieved it with reverent hands, showing Svala the intricate carvings that spiraled across its surface. This is the Truth-Seeker's stone, Astrid whispered. It was carved by the first seers too. Settle in this land, blessed with the power to reveal truth and dispel illusions. If your visions are accurate, if Eirik truly is innocent, this stone will prove it. Svala reached out to touch the artifact and immediately felt power flowing through her fingertips. The stone grew warm in response to her touch, its runes beginning to glow with soft blue light. For a moment she saw everything, past, present, and the threads of possible futures stretching out before them. He's waiting, she said softly. He knows we're coming. As they slipped from the village into the shadow of the old forest, neither woman nor child noticed the figure watching from Magnus's window. His eyes followed their retreat with the cold calculation of a predator, already planning his next move. If the child truly possessed the sight, if she could reveal what he had worked so carefully to conceal, then she represented a threat that could not be allowed to survive. The game had begun, and Magnus Eriksson intended to win it, no matter the cost. The old forest welcomed them with shadows that seemed to breathe and whisper. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked most of the morning sun, creating a twilight world where normal rules no longer applied. Astrid led the way along paths that existed more in memory than reality, following roots. Her grandmother had shown her decades ago, when she was barely older than Svala. "Stay close," the wise woman murmured, her staff glowing faintly with protective runes. These woods remember the old times, when gods and giants walked among the trees. They do not always welcome visitors kindly. Svala clutched the truth-seeker's stone against her chest, feeling its warmth pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the stronger her visions became. She could see glimpses of Eirik's suffering, feel the burning agony of the cursed chains, sense his growing despair as hope slowly died within his massive frame. Behind them, though they did not yet know it, Magnus had wasted little time assembling a hunting party. He had gone straight to Jarl Hrothgar with a carefully crafted tale of the child's dangerous delusions, and Astrid's apparent encouragement of treasonous thoughts. The grief-stricken Jarl, still raw from the loss of his son and the betrayal of his most trusted warrior, had been all too willing to authorize their pursuit. "The child has been touched by madness," Magnus had explained with perfect false sincerity. "She speaks of visions that could undermine everything we've worked to rebuild." And Astrid, influenced by misguided compassion, has chosen to flee rather than seek proper healing for the girl's troubled mind. 6 armed men now followed their trail through the forest, led by Gunnar Ironarm, a veteran warrior who had served alongside Eirik in many campaigns. Gunnar harbored his own doubts about his former brother-in-arm's guilt, but loyalty to his Jarl outweighed personal feelings. He had been ordered to bring back the woman and child safely, with Magnus's private instruction that accidents sometimes happened in the dangerous depths of the old forest. As Astrid and Svala pressed deeper into the woods, they began to encounter signs that they were approaching something significant. The very air seemed to thicken with ancient power. Birds fell silent, and even the wind stilled among the branches. Strange lights flickered between the trees. Not fire, but something older and more primal. "The grove is near," Astrid whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can feel the weight of ages pressing down upon us." They emerged into a circular clearing, where a single massive tree dominated the space. Igra's root stood like a monument to divine judgment, its trunk so wide that 20 men holding hands could not encircle it. Its bark was silver-white, marked with spiraling runes that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. At its base, wrapped in chains that glowed with malevolent energy, sat the broken figure of what had once been the North's most feared warrior. Eirik raised his head as they approached, and Svala gasped at the transformation that suffering had wrought. His face, once proud and strong, was gaunt with pain. His golden beard was matted and streaked with grey, his eyes sunken but still burning with unquenched spirit. The cursed chains had carved deep furrows into his flesh, leaving patterns of scar tissue that told the story of 3 months of agony. "Astrid," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse, "you should not have come here. This place is cursed, and I am beyond redemption." "You are innocent," Svala said simply, stepping forward without fear. "The chains lie, just as your brother lied." Eirik's eyes widened as he truly saw the child for the first time. Something stirred within him, a recognition that went deeper than memory, as if he were looking upon a figure from the oldest stories his grandfather had told around winter fires. "Child, you speak of things that cannot be proven," he said gently. "Magnus testified under oath." "Magnus killed Prince Björn," Svala interrupted, her small voice carrying absolute conviction. I have seen it in dreams that never lie. He struck down the prince in his chambers, planted the bloodied blade with your mark, and arranged for witnesses to place you near the scene. He wanted your position as the Jarl's right hand, and when young Björn began to suspect his true nature, he silenced him forever. The truth-seeker's stone in Svala's hands began to glow brighter, responding to the proximity of the accused and the power of truth being spoken. Eirik stared at the artifact with growing wonder, recognizing it from legends he had thought were mere children's tales. "The truth-seeker's stone," he breathed. "I thought it was lost to legend." "Legends have a way of returning when they are most needed," Astrid said, approaching the great tree cautiously. "Child, place your hand upon his shoulder as you did in your dreams. Let the stone's power flow through you both." As Svala reached out, the cursed chains suddenly flared with angry red light, as if sensing the threat to their hold. Pain shot through Eirik's body, causing him to cry out despite his stoic nature, but Svala did not hesitate. Her small hand touched his shoulder, and immediately the truth-seeker's stone blazed with pure white radiance. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. Visions flooded through all three of them, images of the true events surrounding Prince Björn's death. They saw Magnus entering the prince's chambers under cover of darkness, saw the struggle that ensued when the young man confronted him about suspicious dealings with rival clans. They witnessed the moment when Magnus drove his blade into the prince's chest, felt the shock and betrayal in Björn's final moments. They saw Magnus planting evidence, bribing witnesses, even using dark magic to corrupt the cursed chains so they would burn innocent flesh as readily as guilty. The scope of his treachery was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. "By the gods!" Eirik whispered, tears streaming down his scarred cheeks. "My own brother! My own blood!" The chains around his wrists and ankles began to smoke and crack as the stone's truth-revealing power battled against the false magic that bound them. But breaking free would require more than just knowledge of innocence. It would demand a power greater than what Magnus had used to corrupt them. That's when they heard the sound of approaching footsteps and the clink of armor through the trees. Gunnar's hunting party had found their trail. "We must hide," Astrid said urgently, but Svala shook her head. "No more hiding," the child said, with a wisdom far beyond her years. "The truth has been revealed. Now it must be defended." As the warriors emerged into the clearing, Gunnar Ironarm found himself face to face with a scene that challenged everything he had been told. The child stood fearlessly beside the chained giant, holding an artifact of legend that blazed with divine light. The wise woman raised her staff in clear preparation for battle, and Eirik himself looked up with eyes that burned not with guilt, but with righteous fury at the injustice done to him. "Stand aside," Gunnar commanded, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "We have come for the woman and child, on orders of Magnus Eriksson and Jarl Hrothgar." "Then you serve a murderer and his grief-blind master," Svala replied calmly. "The truth stands revealed. Will you help us carry it home, or will you silence it forever?" Gunnar Ironarm stood frozen at the edge of the sacred grove, his weathered face a map of conflicting loyalties. Behind him, 5 warriors shifted uneasily, their hands resting on weapon hilts, but making no move to draw steel. The sight before them defied everything they thought they knew about justice and guilt. The truth-seeker's stone continued to pulse with ethereal light, and in that radiance, each man present could feel echoes of the visions that had been revealed. Fragments of truth leaked from the artifact like water through cupped hands, glimpses of Magnus's treachery, flashes of Prince Björn's final moments, the weight of innocence chained to sacred wood. "Gunnar," Eirik said softly, his voice carrying across the clearing with the authority of their shared battles. "You and I have stood shield to shield against the Saxon raiders. We have shared bread and blood in a dozen campaigns. Look into my eyes and tell me what you see." The veteran warrior took a reluctant step forward, his scarred features etched with pain. He had known Eirik for 15 years, had watched him save countless lives, had seen him show mercy to defeated enemies when lesser men would have chosen slaughter. The man chained before him bore little resemblance to the cold-blooded murderer Magnus had described. "I see a man I once called brother," Gunnar admitted quietly. "But I also see the chains of judgment that burn your flesh. How do we reconcile these truths?" Svala stepped forward, the stone's light seeming to emanate from her very skin. The chains were corrupted by the same dark magic that concealed the real killer's identity. Magnus sought power over more than just men. He made bargains with forces that should have remained undisturbed. From within her robes, Astrid produced a small bone needle, its surface inscribed with protective runes. "This belonged to my grandmother, who was present when these chains were first forged. She told me the secret words that could test their true nature." The wise woman began to chant in the old tongue, words that predated the coming of the new gods and reached back to the time of giants and world trees. As her voice rose and fell in ancient rhythms, the cursed chains began to react violently. The iron links writhed like living serpents, their red glow shifting to an unnatural green that spoke of corruption and deceit. Smoke rose from their surface, and within that smoke, the warriors could see shapes, shadow figures that whispered lies and fed on suffering. "Dark magic," breathed Thorvald, the youngest of Gunnar's men. "Someone has twisted the judgment of the gods themselves." But even as the truth became undeniable, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the forest. Magnus himself was coming, having grown impatient with his hunting party's delay. He rode with a dozen more warriors, ostensibly to ensure the safe return of the mad child and her misguided guardian. In reality, he came to ensure that no witnesses survived to speak of what they had learned. "He comes to silence us all," Eirik said grimly. "Magnus cannot allow the truth to return to Ironhold. Too much depends on maintaining his version of events." Gunnar's internal struggle played out across his weathered features. Loyalty to his Jarl warred with growing certainty that they had been deceived. His men looked to him for guidance, their own doubts clear in their expressions. "If what the child says is true," Gunnar said slowly, "then we face a choice that will define the rest of our lives. Do we serve justice or merely the powerful?" The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by Magnus's voice calling out commands. "Surround the grove. Let none escape. We deal with madness and treason today." Astrid clutched her bone needle tighter, feeling the weight of generations pressing down upon her. "There is a way to break the corrupted chains," she said urgently. "But it requires a willing sacrifice. Someone must take upon themselves the pain that was meant for the guilty, drawing out the dark magic so the truth can be fully revealed." "I will do it," Gunnar said without hesitation. But Svala shook her head. "The sacrifice must come from one who shares blood with both the innocent and the guilty," she said, her young voice heavy with wisdom beyond her years. "Only family can undo what family has wrought." Eirik's eyes widened with understanding. "You speak of Magnus, but he will never willingly—" "Not Magnus," Svala interrupted. "You, Eirik Skullbreaker, you must forgive your brother, even knowing what he has done. You must choose love over vengeance, mercy over justice. Only then will the chains recognize their error and release you." The concept was staggering in its simplicity and difficulty. After months of torture and betrayal, after watching his honor stripped away and his name made poison in the mouths of his people, Eirik was being asked to forgive the architect of his destruction. Magnus burst into the clearing at the head of his war party, his eyes immediately fixing on the glowing stone in Svala's hands. "Destroy that artifact," he commanded. "It spreads dangerous illusions that threaten the stability of our realm." But his warriors hesitated, seeing Gunnar and his men standing protective around the chained giant, rather than restraining the child and wise woman. The division in the ranks was immediate and obvious. "Gunnar, what is the meaning of this?" Magnus demanded, though his voice carried an edge of fear beneath the anger. The meaning, brother, Eirik said, rising as much as his chains would allow, is that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it is buried. He looked directly at Magnus, seeing past the mask of righteousness to the terrified, guilty soul beneath. I know what you did, Magnus. I know why you did it. And I forgive you. The words hit Magnus like physical blows, but their effect on the cursed chains was even more dramatic. The corrupted iron began to crack and split, dark smoke pouring from the breaks as the evil magic that powered them was drawn out and dissipated. The green glow faded, replaced by the clean silver light of true judgment. No, Magnus snarled, drawing his sword. I will not let childhood fantasies destroy everything I have built. But as the chains finally shattered completely, falling away, from Eirik's wrists and ankles like dead things, a new power entered the grove. The great tree Ygra's root began to glow with its own inner light, and in that radiance all present could see the truth written in letters of fire across the very. Ere Magnus Eriksson, kinslayer and oathbreaker, stood exposed before gods and men alike. The question now was whether justice would finally be served, or whether the corruption ran too deep to be cleansed by mere truth. The sacred grove erupted into chaos as the truth blazed across the heavens themselves. Warriors who had ridden with Magnus found themselves face to face with divine revelation, their certainties crumbling like sand castles before the tide. The very air shimmered with power as Ygra's root bore witness to innocence vindicated and treachery exposed. Eirik rose to his full height for the first time in 3 months, his massive frame unfolding like a mountain taking shape. The scars, left by the cursed chains, still marked his flesh, but they no longer burned with false judgment. Instead, they had become badges of honor, proof of suffering endured with dignity, of faith maintained despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Magnus, back toward the edge of the clearing, his sword drawn but trembling in his grip. The carefully constructed mask of righteousness had been torn away, leaving only naked ambition and desperate fear. Around him, his own warriors began to lower their weapons, unwilling to stand against divine truth. "This is madness!" Magnus shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You would believe the fevered dreams of a child over the sworn testimony of a trusted advisor. I have served Jarl Hrothgar faithfully for years. You have served only yourself," Gunnar interrupted, his own blade now pointed at the man he had once called friend. "The stone shows us truth, Magnus. We have all seen Prince Björn's final moments, felt his confusion and betrayal as you drove steel into his heart. From the scattered remnants of the cursed chains, a new artifact began to emerge. The iron fragments were reforming themselves, but this time under the influence of pure divine will rather than corrupted magic. They twisted and flowed like liquid metal, taking the shape of a magnificent torque, a neckring worthy of the greatest heroes. This was the Chain of Truth, an artifact that would bear witness to the events of this day for generations yet unborn. Svala reached down and lifted the newly formed torque, its surface warm and smooth beneath her small fingers. The runes that decorated its circumference told the story of innocence proven and justice delayed but not denied. "This belongs to you," she said, offering it to Eirik. "Wear it as a reminder that truth endures, even when the whole world chooses to believe." A lie. As Eirik accepted the torque and placed it around his thick neck, power flowed through him. Not the berserker's rage that had made him feared in battle, but something deeper and more enduring. This was the strength that came from suffering overcome, from forgiveness freely given, despite every reason for hatred. Magnus's remaining supporters melted away like morning mist, unwilling to stand against such obvious divine favor. Even his most loyal retainers found reasons to study their boots, rather than meet his desperate gaze. Only a handful of men remained at his side, mercenaries whose loyalty extended only as far as their purses, and men so deeply complicit in his schemes that they had no choice but to fight. "You think this changes anything?" Magnus snarled, though sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool forest air. "Jarl Hrothgar has already pronounced judgment. The village believes Eirik guilty. What will you do? Ride back and claim that children's magic has overturned lawful justice?" It was a fair question, and one that weighed heavily on every warrior present. The evidence was compelling, even overwhelming, but convincing an entire village to overturn their understanding of events would be no simple task. Magnus had spent months carefully crafting his version of the truth, seeding doubt and suspicion with masterful skill. "We will do what we must," Eirik said simply. "Truth stands on its own merit. It needs no argument or persuasion, only courage to speak it and wisdom to recognize it." From the forest depths came an unexpected sound, the low, mournful call of a horn. But this was no human instrument. The note seemed to come from the earth itself, rising through root and stone to announce that the old powers were stirring. Ancient oaths were being remembered, forgotten alliances awakening from long slumber. Astrid's eyes widened with recognition and something approaching terror. "The wild hunt," she whispered. "The sound comes from the horn of Herne, lost for 3 generations. Something approaches that has not walked these lands since the gods were young." The temperature in the grove began to drop noticeably, and frost formed on the leaves despite the autumn warmth. Between the trees, shapes began to move, tall figures cloaked in shadow and starlight, riding mounts that seemed carved from living night. At their head rode a figure from the oldest legends, the huntsman himself, bearing the horn of Herne that called the faithful to account. Magnus's face went white as winter bone. These were powers far beyond his ability to control or manipulate, forces that recognized only truth and cared nothing for political convenience. His dark bargains had attracted attention he never intended to draw. "The hunt comes for oath-breakers and kinslayers," the huntsman spoke, his voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Magnus Eriksson, you have violated the most sacred bonds that hold civilization together. You have murdered your prince, betrayed your brother, and corrupted the very instruments of divine justice. Answer for your crimes." But Magnus was not finished. From within his robes, he produced an artifact that made even Eirik take a step backward. A blade forged from metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. This was Kinsbane, a cursed weapon that grew stronger with each act of family. Betrayal. Its very presence made the air feel thick and poisonous. "I answer to no power save my own will," Magnus declared, raising the evil blade. "I have paid for this moment with blood and treachery, and I will not surrender it to children's magic and ancient superstitions." The cursed sword began to pulse with malevolent energy, and where its influence touched, the very life seemed to drain from the grove. Flowers withered, leaves turned black and fell from their branches, and even the great Igra's root seemed to recoil from its presence. But Svala stepped forward fearlessly, the truth-seeker's stone blazing in response to the proximity of such inconcentrated evil. "Your power comes from breaking bonds," she said to Magnus. "Mine comes from forging them. Let us see which proves stronger." The child placed her free hand on Eirik's arm, and immediately the chain of truth around his neck began to glow with matching intensity. Astrid joined them, adding her own deep knowledge of the old ways to their combined will. Even Gunnar and his warriors stepped closer, offering their strength to the growing circle of light that began to push back against Kinsbane's corruption. The scene, battle between truth and treachery, was about to begin in earnest. The sacred grove became a battlefield where light and darkness clashed with primal fury. Magnus wielded Kinsbane with desperate skill, the cursed blade leaving trails of shadow that seemed to tear holes in reality itself. Each swing of the weapon drew power from his past betrayals, feeding on the poison of broken trust and murdered innocence. But opposing him stood forces that had endured since the world's foundation. The chain of truth around Eirik's neck pulsed. With steady radiance, each beat like the heartbeat of justice itself. Svala held the truth-seeker's stone high, its light cutting through Magnus's deceptions as easily as a sword through silk. And behind them, the wild hunt watched with eyes like cold stars, waiting to claim the soul of the kinslayer. "You cannot defeat what I have become," Magnus snarled, his blade carving arcs of corruption through the air. "Every lie I have told, every trust I have broken, every innocent life I have claimed, all of it feeds my power now. I am beyond the reach of your simple justice." As if to prove his words, the shadows cast by Kinsbane began to take physical form. They rose from the ground like smoke given substance, reaching for the defenders with grasping fingers made of pure malice. Where they touched, warmth fled and hope died. Even the great tree seemed to shudder under their influence. Astrid raised her staff, speaking words of warding that her grandmother had taught her, but the shadows pressed forward nonetheless. "The corruption runs deeper than I feared," she called. "Out. He has been feeding this blade for years, preparing for this moment." From the depths of the forest came an answer to her concern. The horn of Herne sounded again, and this time it was joined by other voices. The howl of wind through ancient branches, the song of water over stone, the deep rumble of earth awakening from slumber. The old forest itself was taking sides in this conflict. Roots burst from the ground around Magnus's feet, trying to entangle him, but Kinsbane severed them with ease. Each cut released a spray of what looked disturbingly like blood, as if the very land was being wounded. The trees themselves began to move, their branches reaching for the kinslayer, but his cursed weapon carved through them as if they were mere saplings. "The natural world rejects him," Eirik observed, his warrior's eye assessing the battle's flow. "But his corruption is too strong for earth and wood alone to overcome." That's when Svala made a decision that would haunt her dreams for years to come. She stepped away from the protective circle, walking directly toward Magnus, despite the deadly shadows that writhed around him. The truth-seeker's stone in her hands blazed brighter with each step, but she could feel the weight of evil pressing down upon her like a physical thing. "Child, no!" Astrid cried out, but Svala did not falter. "Your power comes from betrayal," Svala said to Magnus, her young voice somehow carrying clearly through the chaos. "But you cannot betray what never trusted you. You cannot corrupt what sees you clearly. You cannot destroy what forgives you freely." Magnus laughed, the sound harsh and bitter as winter wind. "Forgiveness? From you? What do you know of the choices I've made, the prices I've paid? Your innocence means nothing here, child." But even as he spoke, his blade seemed to waver in his grip. Kinsbane fed on the corruption of bonds between people. Family ties turned toxic, friendships poisoned with deceit, love transformed into hatred. It had no power over someone who offered understanding without judgment, compassion without condition. The shadows around Magnus began to retreat as Svala drew closer, their substance growing thin and insubstantial. For the first time since drawing his cursed weapon, doubt flickered in the kinslayer's eyes. "I see you," Svala said simply. "Not the monster you've become, but the boy who once loved his brother. The young man who dreamed of honor and glory. The son who wanted nothing more than to make his father proud. All of that is still inside you, buried beneath the choices you've made." From behind her came the sound of Eirik rising to his feet. The giant warrior had reclaimed something of his old presence. Not the berserker rage that had made him feared, but the steady strength that had made him beloved. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of mountains. "She speaks truth, brother. I see you too. I see the child who followed me into the forest when we were young, who wanted to be just like his elder brother. I see the man who stood beside me in battle, who saved my life more than once. That man still exists, Magnus. It's not too late to remember who you were meant to be." The effect on Magnus was immediate and devastating. The cursed blade in his hands began to smoke and crack, its power fracturing as the very foundations of his corruption were challenged. Kinsbane fed on hatred and betrayal, but it withered in the face of love freely offered despite every reason for revenge. "No," Magnus whispered, then louder. "No, I will not be unmade by sentiment and weakness." He raised the blade high, preparing to strike down both child and brother in one desperate blow. But the weapon shattered in his hands. The destruction of Kinsbane sent shockwaves through the grove. But these were waves of healing rather than harm. The shadows that had defiled the sacred space dissolved like mist before sunrise. The wounded trees began to mend themselves, their severed branches growing whole again. Even the ground itself seemed to sigh with relief as the corruption was finally cleansed. Magnus stood empty-handed in the center of the grove, stripped of power and pretense alike. For the first time in years, his true face was visible. Not the mask of righteousness he had worn for so long, but the features of a man who had lost his way so completely that he no longer remembered what home looked like. The huntsman of the Wild Hunt dismounted from his shadow steed and approached the broken kinslayer. In his hand, he carried a new artifact that had formed from the remnants of the shattered Kinsbane, a simple wooden cup carved with runes of redemption. This was the chalice of second chances, offered only to those who had fallen so far that they might yet remember how to rise. "Magnus Eriksson," the huntsman said, his voice no longer terrible but merely infinitely sad. "You have committed crimes that echo through the very foundations of the world. But even kinslayers may find redemption if they have the courage to face what they have done and the will to make amends." Magnus stared at the cup as if it were a serpent, his whole body trembling with the effort of a choice that would define the remainder of his existence. Behind him, his few remaining followers had already begun to slip away into the forest, unwilling to face the judgment that was coming. The moment of decision had arrived, and all of creation seemed to hold its breath. Magnus stared at the chalice. Of second chances for what felt like an eternity, his face a battlefield of warring emotions. The carved wood seemed to pulse with its own inner light, offering redemption to a soul that had long since given up hope of salvation. Around him, the grove held its breath, waiting for a choice that would echo through the ages. Then slowly, Magnus reached out and took the cup. The moment his fingers touched the sacred wood, power flowed through him, not the corrupted strength he had drawn from Kinsbane, but something infinitely more precious. This was the power of possibility, the chance to become something other than what he had made himself. Tears began to flow down his cheeks as the full weight of his crimes crashed down upon him. "I killed him," Magnus whispered, his voice breaking like a child's. "My prince, my lord's son. I drove steel into his heart because he discovered my dealings with the Saxon gold merchants. He was going to expose me, destroy everything I had built. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't." But as the words left his lips, something extraordinary occurred. The admission of guilt, spoken freely and without coercion, began to unravel. The careful web of lies he had woven, the false witnesses he had bribed, found their memories clearing, their tongues loosened to speak truth instead of purchased testimony. The dark magic he had used to corrupt the evidence began to fade, revealing the reality he had worked so hard to conceal. "There's more," Magnus continued, his voice growing stronger as the burden of deception lifted from his shoulders. "The Saxon raids that have plagued our southern borders. I arranged them. I sold information about our defenses, our patrol routes, our weaknesses. The gold they paid me funded my rise to power, bought the loyalty of men who should have served honor instead. Of coin." Gasps echoed through the grove as the full scope of his treachery was revealed. But Magnus was not finished. Years of suppressed guilt poured out of him like water from a broken dam. "And before all that, there was our father's death," he said. looking directly at Eirik for the first time since the truth had been revealed. You always wondered why he fell from his horse during that simple ride to the neighboring village. It wasn't an accident, brother. I loosened the saddle straps because he was going to name you as his heir instead of me. Even then, I couldn't bear to be second to you in anything. The revelation hit Eirik like a physical blow. Their father's death had haunted him for years, filled him with guilt for not being there to prevent it. To learn that it had been murder all along, orchestrated by his own brother, was almost too much to bear. Yet even now, even with this ultimate betrayal revealed, he did not turn away. "Magnus," Eirik said softly, extending his hand toward his brother, "you have carried these burdens alone for too long. Let me help you bear them now." But before Magnus could respond, another voice cut through the sacred silence of the grove. It came from behind them, from the path that led back toward Ironhold, and it carried the authority of absolute command. Enough of this madness. Jarl Hrothgar himself rode into the clearing, his face twisted with grief and rage. Behind him came a small army of warriors, their spears gleaming in the dappled sunlight. The old Jarl's eyes took in the scene before him, his former champion freed from cursed chains, his trusted advisor weeping while holding a mysterious chalice, the child, and wise woman standing surrounded by artifacts of power. "I have heard wild tales," Hrothgar declared, his voice echoing off the ancient trees. "Stories of innocence proven and guilt revealed. But I will not be swayed by tricks of light and shadow, by the fevered dreams of children and the desperate claims of condemned men." The truth-seeker's stone in Svala's hands began to pulse more brightly, responding to the presence of one who held the power to set things right or perpetuate injustice. But there was something else in its light now, a warning, a recognition of danger that made the child's breath catch in her throat. "My lord," Magnus began, rising from his knees with the chalice still clutched in his hands, "I must tell you—" "Silence!" Hrothgar roared. "You have served me faithfully since my son's death, Magnus. I will not see you corrupted by the same." Madness that has clearly taken hold here, his eyes fixed on Eirik with undisguised hatred. "And you, Kinslayer Oathbreaker, did you think to escape justice with parlor tricks and children's games?" That's when Svala saw it, the truth that the stone had been trying to warn her about. In the Jarl's eyes, behind the grief and rage, lurked something else entirely, something that made her blood run cold and her small hands tremble around the artifact she carried. "You knew," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the grove. "You knew Magnus was guilty. You've known all along." Hrothgar's face went pale, then flushed with dangerous color. "Child, you speak of things beyond your understanding. You knew about the Saxon gold," Svala continued, the stone's power flowing through her and revealing layer upon layer of hidden truth. "You knew about the arranged raids, about the information being sold to our enemies. You allowed it because it served your purposes." The revelation struck the assembled warriors like a thunderbolt. Their beloved Jarl, the man they had sworn to serve unto death, stood accused of treachery as black as Magnus's own crimes. But Svala was not finished. "Prince Björn discovered not just Magnus's betrayal, but yours as well," she said, tears streaming down her young face as the full horror of the truth became clear. "He confronted you first, didn't he? He demanded that you expose Magnus and end the corruption that was rotting our realm from within." Hrothgar's hand moved to his sword hilt, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "I will not listen to such poison from the lips of a mad child." "So you sent him to Magnus," Svala pressed on relentlessly. "You told your son to confront his uncle privately, to give him a chance to confess and make amends. But you knew what would happen. You knew Magnus would kill rather than face exposure. You used your own son's honor against him, turned his trust into a weapon that would eliminate the one person who could destroy you both." The silence that followed was deafening. Warriors who had served Hrothgar for decades stared at him with growing horror, seeing their lord's familiar features in an entirely new light. the man they had revered as the embodiment of justice and honor stood revealed as the architect of his own son's murder. From the chalice in Magnus's hands came a new artifact, the mirror of hidden truth, its surface reflecting not physical forms, but the secret desires and buried crimes of all who looked upon it. As Hrothgar caught sight of his reflection, he saw himself as he truly was, a father who had sacrificed his child for political convenience, a ruler who had sold his people's safety for personal gain. "My son," Hrothgar whispered, the words torn from his very soul. "My beautiful boy, what have I done?" The revelation changed everything. The guilt Magnus bore was real and terrible, but he had been as much a victim as a perpetrator, manipulated by a master who understood his weaknesses and exploited them without mercy. The true architect of the conspiracy stood exposed at last, and with that exposure came the most dangerous moment yet. For a man who had sacrificed his own son would not hesitate to kill everyone in the grove to protect his secrets. The sacred grove transformed into a powder keg of barely contained violence as the full scope of Jarl Hrothgar's betrayal settled over the assembled warriors. Men who had sworn blood oaths to their lord found themselves staring at a stranger wearing a familiar face. A father who had orchestrated his own son's murder, a leader who had sold his people's lives for Saxon gold. Hrothgar's hand tightened on his sword hilt as he surveyed the scene before him. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, but he was still a jarl, still a man who commanded armies and decided the fate of kingdoms. If truth threatened to destroy him, then truth itself would have to die. "Seize them all," he commanded his warriors, his voice carrying the authority of decades of absolute rule. "The child is clearly touched by madness, and it spreads like a plague to all who listen. We will return to Ironhold and cleanse this corruption with fire and steel." But his words fell on increasingly deaf ears. The warriors who had ridden with him were not mere hired swords. They were men of honor who had believed they served justice itself. To learn that their oaths had been twisted into chains binding them to evil shook the very foundations of their world. Gunnar Ironarm stepped forward, his scarred face etched with pain that went deeper than any physical wound. "My lord," he said, "carefully we have seen truth written in letters of fire across the very sky. The stone of the truth-seekers does not lie, nor do the artifacts of the old gods. How can we ignore what our own eyes have witnessed?" "Because your eyes have been deceived by sorcery," Hrothgar snarled, drawing his blade at last. The steel sang as it cleared the scabbard, but the sound was discordant, wrong somehow. This was no longer a weapon wielded in service of justice, but a tool of desperate murderers. "I will not see my realm torn apart by children's fantasies and the ravings of proven traitors." The Jarl's sword bore its own terrible history, a blade called Oathkeeper that had been passed down through his line for 7 generations. But as he raised it now, in service of lies and murder, the weapon began to change. The bright steel darkened, its edge growing jagged and cruel. The runes that decorated its fuller shifted and writhed, transforming from symbols of honor into marks of betrayal. Oathkeeper was becoming something new and terrible. Oathbreaker, a cursed blade that would drink the blood of innocents and feed on the destruction of sacred bonds. Eirik rose to his full height, the chain of truth around his neck blazing with righteous fire. Though he bore no weapon, his presence filled the grove like the shadow of a mountain. "Hrothgar," he said, his voice carrying the weight of their shared history, "you were like a father to me. You taught me honor, showed me what it meant to protect the weak and defend the innocent. That man still exists somewhere inside you. Find him before it's too late." For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in the Jarl's eyes, a ghost of the man he had once been, the leader who had earned the love and loyalty of his people through justice and wisdom. But it was too late for such salvation. He had traveled too far down the dark path to turn back now. That man died with my son, Hrothgar said bitterly. What you see before you is what remains. A ruler who will do whatever is necessary to preserve order and stability, even if it means silencing inconvenient truths. Behind him, his warriors began to spread out in a loose circle, but their movements were uncertain, reluctant. These were not mindless thugs, but seasoned fighters who had served with honor for years. The conflict between duty and conscience played out across their weathered faces as they struggled to reconcile their oaths with their growing understanding of the truth. Astrid clutched her staff tighter, feeling the power of the old forest stirring around them. The ancient trees seemed to lean inward, their branches creaking ominously as they prepared to defend the sacred grove from desecration. But she knew that nature's power alone would not be enough to stand against a determined force of armed warriors, especially not when they were led by a man who had abandoned all restraint. "There is still a way," she whispered to Svala, her voice barely audible above the tension crackling through the air. "The ritual of binding. It could force the truth upon all present, make it impossible for lies to take root. But it requires willing sacrifice from one who has the power to command absolute loyalty." Svala's eyes widened as she understood the implication. The ritual would need Magnus to offer himself freely, to use his position as Hrothgar's trusted advisor to speak. Truth that could not be denied or dismissed. But the cost would be terrible. The magic would burn away everything false within him, leaving only truth behind. For a man who had built his entire life on deception, it would be a kind of death. Magnus himself seemed to sense their unspoken conversation. He stepped forward, the chalice of second chances still clutched in his trembling hands, and faced the Jarl, who had been both his partner in crime and his eventual destroyer. "My lord," Magnus said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do, "I have one final service to offer you, one last act of loyalty before we both face the judgment of gods and men." Hrothgar's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What do you mean?" "The truth," Magnus replied simply, "spoken freely without coercion or corruption before all who have gathered here. You asked me to serve you faithfully, and I have. But my greatest service will be to free you from the web of lies we have woven together." The transformation that came over Magnus as he spoke was remarkable to behold. Years of guilt and self-hatred seemed to fall away like shed skin, leaving behind a man who looked remarkably like the youth who had once followed his elder brother into battle with stars in his eyes. The chalice in his hands began to glow brighter, its light spreading outward in ripples that touched every person present. "I stand before you all as Magnus Eriksson, kinslayer and oathbreaker," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the grove. "I murdered Prince Björn at my lord's direction, though Jarl Hrothgar ensured that I would bear the guilt alone. I betrayed our defenses to Saxon raiders in exchange for gold that funded my rise to power. I killed my own father to secure an inheritance that was never meant to be mine." With each confession, the light from the chalice grew stronger, and with it came an undeniable compulsion for truth. The very air seemed to thicken with honesty, making deception impossible for anyone touched by its influence. "But the greatest evil was not mine alone," Magnus continued relentlessly. "Jarl Hrothgar knew of my dealings with our enemies. He allowed Saxon raids to continue because they weakened rival clans and strengthened his own position. When his son discovered our crimes and demanded justice, my lord sent the boy to confront me privately, knowing that I would kill rather than face exposure. The warriors around Hrothgar began to back away from their lord, as the full scope of his treachery became undeniable. The light from the chalice made lies impossible, and in that harsh illumination, every shadowed corner of the conspiracy was laid bare for all to see. "We used Eirik's honor against him," Magnus concluded, tears streaming down his face. "We knew he would never believe such accusations without proof, so we manufactured evidence to support our version of events. We corrupted the sacred chains of judgment, bribed witnesses, and planted false testimony. An innocent man suffered for our crimes, while we basked in undeserved glory. Hrothgar's face twisted with rage and desperation as he realized that his last hope of containing the truth had just been destroyed. "You fool!" he screamed at Magnus. "You have doomed us both." Oathbreaker rose in his hands, its blade now completely transformed into an instrument of pure malice. But as he prepared to strike down his former partner in crime, other forces began to move in the grove. The wild hunt stepped forward from their positions among the trees, their spectral forms gaining substance as they prepared to claim the souls of oathbreakers and child killers. The final confrontation was about to begin, and this time, there would be no escape for those who had chosen darkness over light. The only question that remained was how many innocents would fall before justice was finally served. The cursed blade Oathbreaker descended toward Magnus with the weight of accumulated betrayals behind it, but it never found its mark. Eirik moved, with the fluid grace of a warrior reborn, catching his brother around the waist and rolling them both away from the Jarl's murderous strike. The blade carved a furrow in the sacred earth where Magnus had stood, and where it touched, the grass withered and died. "You will not add another murder to your count while I draw breath," Eirik declared, placing himself between the Jarl and his repentant brother. Though he bore no weapon, his massive frame radiated a power that made even seasoned warriors take a step backward. Hrothgar's laugh was the sound of sanity finally snapping under too much pressure. "And what will you do, Oathbreaker? Fight me with your bare hands? I am still your lord, still the man who commands the loyalty of every warrior in this grove." But even as he spoke, his hold over his men continued to crumble. The light from the chalice of second chances had touched them all, making truth impossible to ignore. Warriors who had served Hrothgar faithfully for decades found themselves backing away from their lord, their faces twisted with disgust and betrayal. "Not every warrior," Gunnar Ironarm said quietly, drawing his own blade, but instead of pointing it toward Eirik and the others, he aimed it directly at his former lord's heart. "I swore an oath to serve justice and protect the innocent. I will not break that oath, even for you." One by one, the other warriors followed suit. Men who had ridden into the grove as Hrothgar's loyal retainers now stood arrayed against him, their faces grim with the weight of duty that transcended personal loyalty. They had heard truth spoken in words that could not be denied, had seen their lord's crimes written in letters of fire across the very air. "Traitors!" Hrothgar snarled, but his voice cracked with desperation. "All of you, traitors and oath-breakers, you forget yourselves." "We remember ourselves," said Thorvald, the youngest of the group. "We remember what it means to serve honor instead of men." The Jarl raised Oathbreaker high, its cursed edge gleaming with malevolent hunger. The blade had tasted innocent blood before and yearned to drink deeply again. But as he prepared to strike, a small voice cut through his rage like a knife through a silk. "Stop!" Svala stepped forward, the truth-seeker's stone blazing in her hands like a captive star. "There has been enough violence, enough death. Your son would not want his murder avenged with more murder." For a moment, Hrothgar's sword arm trembled as memories of his lost child crashed over him. Prince Björn had been everything good and noble about their bloodline, brave without being reckless, strong without being cruel, wise beyond his years. The boy had loved his father completely, trusted him without reservation, and Hrothgar had used that trust to orchestrate his son's destruction. "My son," he whispered, and for an instant the mask of rage slipped to reveal the broken father beneath. "My beautiful boy, he looked at me with such faith, such love. How could I?" His voice cracked completely, and tears began to flow down his weathered cheeks. But the moment of vulnerability passed quickly, replaced by the cold fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. "No, I will not be unmade by sentiment and weakness. I did what was necessary for the good of the realm. Sometimes a ruler must make hard choices, must sacrifice." You sacrificed nothing, Eirik interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of absolute moral certainty. You sent your son to die while you remained safe in your hall. You let Magnus bear the guilt while you played the grieving father. You are no ruler, Hrothgar. You are a coward who hides behind others' blood. The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Whatever remained of Hrothgar's sanity shattered completely, leaving only animal rage and desperate fury. Oathbreaker screamed through the air toward Eirik's unprotected chest, its cursed edge eager to drink the blood of heroes. But the blade never reached its intended victim. Magnus threw himself between them, the chalice of second chances falling from his hands as Oathbreaker punched through his chest. For a moment, time seemed suspended as the two brothers locked eyes, Eirik's wide with shock and grief, Magnus's peaceful despite the agony that must have been tearing through him. I told you I had one final service to offer, Magnus gasped, blood frothing on his lips. This is it, brother. Let my death be the last innocent blood spilled in this cursed place. As life faded from Magnus's eyes, something extraordinary began to happen. The chalice of second chances, fallen to the earth beside his still form, began to crack and split. But instead of being destroyed, it was transforming, becoming something new and terrible and beautiful all at once. The cup of ultimate sacrifice emerged from the ruins of its predecessor, carved not from wood, but from some material that seemed to capture and hold starlight itself. This was an artifact of such power that it made the very air around it sing with possibility. The cup of ultimate sacrifice blazed with light that transcended the physical world, and in that radiance, everyone present could feel the weight of Magnus's final act. His death had not been mere tragedy, it had been transformation, a willing sacrifice that broke the last chains binding the grove to darkness and corruption. Hrothgar stared at the blood on Oathbreaker's blade, his face a mask of dawning horror. The madness that had driven him to strike was already fading, leaving behind the terrible clarity of what he had done. He had not only orchestrated his son's murder, he had now killed with his own hands, adding direct bloodshed to his catalogue. Of crimes, what have I become, he whispered, the cursed sword trembling in his grip. What monster wears my face? The answer came not from the assembled warriors, or even from Eirik, but from the cup of ultimate sacrifice itself. As its light touched Hrothgar, it began to reveal not just his crimes, but the slow corruption that had led him to this moment. They all saw it then. Years of small compromises, minor betrayals that had seemed justified at the time, each one making the next easier until his soul had become a labyrinth of self-deception and buried guilt. You were not born a monster, Svala said gently, her young voice carrying wisdom far beyond her years. You became one, choice by choice, lie by lie, but even monsters can remember what they used to be. The huntsman of the wild hunt stepped forward from his position among the trees, his spectral form gaining substance as he approached the broken Jarl. In his hands he carried chains, not the cursed iron that had bound Eirik, but something far different. These were the chains of truth, forged from starlight and moonbeams, designed not to punish, but to prevent further harm. Hrothgar Ironside. The huntsman spoke, his voice echoing with the authority of powers older than kingdoms. You have violated every oath that binds civilization together. You have murdered your own blood, betrayed your people's trust, and corrupted the very instruments of justice. By rights your soul should be claimed for the darkest realms. Hrothgar fell to his knees, Oathbreaker clattering to the ground beside him. The cursed blade immediately began to dissolve, its evil essence unable to maintain coherence without a wielder's hatred to sustain it. I know, he said simply. I accept whatever punishment awaits me. But the huntsman continued, your crimes were not committed in isolation. They grew from wounds inflicted by others, fed by fears and insecurities that were nurtured by those who should have healed them. Justice demands punishment, but wisdom recognizes that some souls can still be saved. The chains of truth settled around Hrothgar's shoulders, but instead of the burning agony he expected, they brought something he had not felt in years: peace. For the first time since his son's death, the weight of deception lifted from his spirit. He could no longer lie, no longer hide from the truth of what he had done, but that honesty brought a strange sort of freedom. Eirik knelt beside his fallen brother, cradling Magnus's still form with gentle hands. Tears flowed freely down the giant warrior's face as he mourned not just the man who had died, but the boy who had been lost years ago to ambition and corruption. He found his way back, Astrid said softly, placing a comforting hand on Eirik's shoulder. In his final moment he remembered who he was meant to be. That is no small thing. From the depths of the old forest came the sound of approaching voices. Not warriors this time, but the people of Ironhold themselves. Word had somehow spread of the confrontation in the sacred grove, and now they came seeking answers to questions that had haunted them for months. At their head walked the village elders, their faces grave with the weight of what they might find. Svala picked up the cup of ultimate sacrifice, feeling its power flow through her small frame. But this was not a burden she was meant to bear alone. The cup belonged to all of them, to everyone who had suffered under the weight of lies and corruption, to all who had chosen truth over convenience, love over hatred. "Come," she said to the assembled warriors, to the chained Jarl, to the grieving brother who had reclaimed his honor. "Let us return to Ironhold and speak truth to our people. Let us begin the work of healing what has been broken." As they prepared to leave the sacred grove, the wild hunt began to fade back into legend and shadow. Their work here was done. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and the long night of deception was finally coming to an end. The great tree Yggdra's root pulsed with satisfied light, its ancient purpose fulfilled once more. In the distance, hanging from its oak branch, Bonecrusher caught the morning sun on its runic inscriptions. But now those symbols spoke not of violence and conquest, but of honor restored and redemption earned through sacrifice. The long journey home was about to begin. The journey back to Ironhold was unlike any homecoming in the village's long history. At the head of the procession walked Eirik Skullbreaker, no longer the broken figure who had been chained to Yggdra's root, but a man reborn through suffering and forgiveness. The chain of truth around his neck caught the afternoon light, transforming it into patterns that seemed to tell the story of honor restored and justice finally served. Beside him walked Svala, the small orphan girl whose courage had set these momentous events in motion. In her hands she carried the cup of ultimate sacrifice, its starlight surface reflecting not just the physical world, but the hopes and dreams of a people ready to embrace truth after months of living with lies. Behind them came the bound figure of Hrothgar, the chains of truth around his shoulders, ensuring that every word he spoke would be honest, every confession freely given. The former Jarl's face bore the weight of his crimes, but also something that had been absent for years: peace. The terrible burden of deception had been lifted from his spirit, leaving behind a man who could finally face what he had done without flinching away from the truth. The people of Ironhold gathered in the great square as word spread of their return. Faces that had been marked by months of confusion and suspicion now turned toward the approaching figures with a mixture of hope and trepidation. They had lived too long with half-truths and carefully constructed lies. The prospect of finally learning what had really happened was both welcome and terrifying. Astrid, the wise woman, stepped forward to address the crowd, her weathered features calm despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "People of Ironhold," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the square, "we have journeyed to the sacred grove and there learned truths that will shake the very foundations of what we believed. But truth, however painful, is the only foundation upon which a just society can be built. One by one, the artifacts were revealed and their stories told. The truth-seeker's stone blazed with inner light as Svala recounted her visions of Magnus's crimes. The chain of truth around Eirik's neck pulsed with each word of his vindication. The cup of ultimate sacrifice glowed softly as they spoke of Magnus's final redemption through willing sacrifice. But it was Hrothgar himself who provided the most powerful testimony. Bound by chains that made deception impossible, he confessed everything. His knowledge of Magnus's treachery, his complicity in the Saxon raids, his cold-blooded manipulation of events that led to his own son's death. With each revelation, the crowd's gasps and cries grew louder, until the very air seemed thick with the weight of shared betrayal. "I stand before you not as your Jarl," Hrothgar said when his confession was complete, "but as a man who has forfeited every right to lead or command. I have broken the most sacred bonds that hold our society together. I have betrayed your trust, sold your safety, and murdered my own blood. I ask not for forgiveness, such a gift would be beyond my deserving, but only that you learn from my failures and choose leaders worthy of the faith you place in them." The village elders conferred quietly among themselves before Elder Gunhild stepped forward to address the crowd. Her silver hair gleamed in the afternoon sun as she raised her staff of office, the carved runes along its length seeming to glow with their own inner fire. "The law is clear," she announced. "When a Jarl betrays his people so completely, leadership passes to the warriors who prove themselves most worthy in the crisis. Eirik Skullbreaker, called the Truth-Seeker, you have shown honor in the face of dishonor, forgiveness in response to betrayal, and courage when courage was most needed. Will you accept the burden of leadership?" Eirik looked out over the faces of his people, for they were truly his people now, bound to him not by blood or conquest, but by shared trials and hard-won trust. He thought of Magnus, whose final sacrifice had made this moment possible. He thought of Prince Björn, whose memory deserved better than the corruption that had surrounded his death. And he thought of the small girl beside him, whose innocent wisdom had shown them all the path back to the light. "I will serve," he said simply, "not as your conqueror or your master, but as your protector and guide. Together, we will rebuild what was broken and ensure that such corruption never takes root among us again." The artifacts of their journey found their permanent homes in the days that followed. The Truth-Seeker's stone was placed in the Temple of Justice, where it would serve as a check against future deceptions. The chain of truth became part of the oath-taking ceremony for all who would serve in positions of authority. The cup of ultimate sacrifice was given a place of honor in the Hall of Remembrance, where Magnus's story would be told as both warning and inspiration for generations to come. As for Svala, she continued to serve as keeper of the sacred artifacts, her unique gift, foreseeing truth through deception, making her an invaluable counselor to the new Jarl. Under her guidance, Ironhold became known throughout the north as a place where justice could be found and truth would always prevail over lies. Hrothgar lived out his remaining years in quiet service, his chains never removed but no longer felt. As burden, he tended the village gardens, cared for the sick and elderly, and spoke truth to any who would listen about the slow corruption that had claimed his soul. In his own way, he found a kind of redemption, not the dramatic gesture of his nephew's final sacrifice, but the steady daily choice to serve others rather than himself. Sometimes the deepest pain comes not from our enemies, but from those we trusted most. But sometimes, if we have the courage to face that pain with honesty and compassion, it can become the foundation for something stronger and more beautiful than what was lost. In the village of Ironhold, nestled in the shadow of the old forest, the people learned to trust again, not blindly, but with the wisdom that comes from having survived betrayal and emerged stronger on the other side. The giant's chains were broken, but the bonds forged in their breaking would endure for all the generations yet to come.